By far, the most common mistake I see offshore anglers make is fishing in the wrong water depth, whether that's too shallow or too deep. In this video, I'm going to explain how to determine the correct depth of water you should be fishing in on your lake when fishing away from the shoreline. Let's get into it. The first and most accurate way to determine how deep you should be fishing offshore is by looking at how deep the bait fish are setting up on your fishery. Bait fish is kind of a catch-all term for the food that the bass are feeding on. For example, on a lot of highland and lowland reservoirs, the primary forage is going to be either gizzard shad, threadfin shad, or maybe blueback herring. However, on natural lakes up north, you might be dealing with more panfish like perch or bluegill, and that's the bait fish that the bass are feeding on. There are a lot of other types of bait fish out there as well. It's going to vary lake by lake, but in general, you should be able to find a type of bait fish that you can see on your fish finder, like this example here. In this down imaging image, you'll see a school of bait fish on the left and a school of bass on the right. Even though the bait fish are suspended over deeper water, they're in the exact same depth of water as the bass. They're in that 10 to 15 foot zone. In general, what you'll find is that the bait fish are going to set up in the same depth as the bass, or the other way to think about it is that the bass are going to be in the same depth as the bait fish because the bass want to eat the bait fish. It really makes sense because wherever those bait fish are, the bass have to be because they need to eat to survive. So those bait fish are setting up in 10 to 15 feet of water. That's where the bass have to be able to eat and to be able to sustain themselves. Therefore, if those bait fish were setting up, let's say, in 30 feet of water, those bass have to be down there in 30 feet as well because that's where their food source is. Just like humans who need to be around a city center where there's restaurants, grocery stores, stuff like that to be able to get their food, bass are going to be where the bait fish are, where their food source is, and they're going to be in the exact same depth of water as that bait. Here's another example from down imaging. Again, your bait fish are on the right side of the screen, the school of bass on the left side of the screen, and they're in the exact same level in the water column, in that 15 to 25 foot zone in this example. Even though those bait fish aren't related to the rock pile you see in the center of the screen, the bait fish are still in the exact same depth of water as those bass. And what those bass are doing is they're waiting behind those rocks for those bait fish to swim over the rocks so they can ambush them. They're set up in that ambush mode. It's pretty cool in this image because you can see those bass position themselves behind an object, waiting for that school of bait fish to come over the top of those rocks so they can eat them. For those anglers who don't have a lot of shad on their fishery and instead have sunfish like perch or bluegill, you can also identify the depth of bait fish by where they bed in the form of bluegill beds. Here's a side imaging image of some bluegill beds. They're set up in 10 to 15 feet of water. This was taken in the middle of the summertime when those bluegill were actually in those beds laying their eggs. During the summer, brim and perch will lay their eggs every full moon and every new moon throughout the entire summer. And if you'll find those bluegill beds in 10 to 15 feet of water, you can be pretty confident that those bass are also going to be setting up in that 10 to 15 foot zone because, again, they need to be in that zone to eat on the bait fish. Now, there's one big exception to the rules I just laid out, and that's when you can't see the forage on your fish finder, either down imaging or side imaging. This happens when bass are feeding on crawfish, gobies, or sculpin, because these types of bait fish will set up tight to the bottom in the rocks, and they're invisible on the fish finder. In this case, you have to use a little bit more of a general rule to determine how deep to fish and some experimentation. One thing we do know, though, about these types of forage is that they like to set up around rocky areas in the bottom. This means you can graph around with your side imaging, down imaging, and 2D sonar to identify rock piles and rocky spots. And then you have to use a general rule of thumb to determine how deep is too deep to actually be fishing. Through my own personal experience fishing offshore and spending thousands of hours fishing offshore areas, I've developed a basic rule of thumb using water clarity to determine how deep you should be fishing if you can't see the bait fish on your fish finder. The rule of thumb is all based on how far you can see into the water. So for example, in dirty water areas that have 0 to 1 foot of visibility, I find that the bass will set up at a maximum depth of about 8 feet. So you don't want to fish any deeper than 8 feet. That's the deepest you should look. Next, we have stained water, which in my model here is 2 to 3 feet of water visibility. The way I get these water visibility ranges is I will actually tie on a white crankbait on the end of my fishing rod, reel it to the tip, stick the tip of the rod in the water, and then when that bait disappears, I will pinch the end of the rod and see if it disappeared 2 feet down, 3 feet down, 4 feet down. Not super scientific, but it gets the job done. And you don't need to be super specific here. This is just, again, a general rule of thumb. So in that stained water, you're looking in less than 15 feet of water. 15 feet is the maximum depth you want to fish. The first major roadblock for new fish finder users is determining which settings to use. If you struggle with this, head to our website, fishthemoment.com, then go to our sonar guides page. Here you'll find our sonar settings guides, which give detailed sonar settings instructions and walk you step by step on how to change all the settings in your fish finder. They're extremely clear and detailed, so even those who struggle with technology can get the settings right first time. I give you ranges on which settings to use based on different lake types, water clarities, things like that, and give you examples of what fish should look like on your fish finder when it's set up properly. You can check out the guides we have available right now and be on the lookout for new guides we're going to be putting out in the near future. Check all them out at fishthemoment.com. Then you have clear water, 4 to 5 foot of visibility, where you don't want to fish any deeper than 25 feet of water. Again, these are just general guidelines that I've established over the years for myself. There are times when I've caught fish deeper than these maximum depths in all of these water visibilities, but that's definitely the exception to the rule. I would say 80 to 90% of the time, these guidelines will work. And for newer anglers, this is a great place to start because you don't really have a good basis to start from anyways. And so I would follow these guidelines as close as you can because you will waste a lot of time if you try to fish deeper than these recommended levels in these different water visibilities. The one thing you call out here is I say less than 25 feet of water or less than 15 feet of water. That means that the fish can be shallower than these guidelines. So, for example, in the clear water visibility, they might be as shallow as 5 feet or as deep as 25 feet. And in the example of fishing those rock piles where the bass are feeding on crawfish or gobies, you might need to side image several rock piles in different depths. 5 feet of water, 10 feet, 15 feet, 20, 25. And then once you have all those rock piles found, you have to fish each rock pile in each depth until you get bit. Once you get bit in that 15-foot depth range, for example, then you can try to find more rock piles in 15 feet of water and duplicate that pattern around the lake. All these guidelines do is give you the maximum depth you need to look. It's not saying you need to fish in 25 feet of water. This makes it a lot more generic and not as specific as the method I showed earlier of finding the bait fish on your fish finder, but sometimes that's not an option, so you can use these guidelines to at least get you a good starting point. Now, ultra clear water gets a little bit tricky. When you have 6+ feet of visibility, the bass can get very deep. I've caught fish on Table Rock Lake as deep as 80 feet of water at times. So it can be tricky to determine how deep you need to be looking because sometimes it's very, very deep. Now in the summer, this is a little bit easier because you can actually use what's called the thermocline to determine how deep you should be fishing. And the thermocline is actually something that you can use to determine the depth of the fish in any water visibility. Now, let me explain what that is. The thermocline is basically this band of water that's formed between the top of the lake, the surface of the lake, and the bottom of the lake. The reason this band of water forms is because water that's closer towards the surface, or where the sky is, has more oxygen and is warmer. This is because the sun is hitting the surface of the water, and air is mixing with the water as the sky and the water meet. However, as you get deeper into the lake, you get further away from the oxygen in the air and further away from the sunshine, so the water gets colder and has less oxygen. The other thing about heat is that warm air, warm water rises, so you're going to have that warm water sitting closer towards the surface, and it's going to stay oxygenated, while that water that's cold will sink down to the bottom and will have less oxygen. Bass and baitfish need oxygen to survive, so they're going to be setting up above that thermocline when it exists, just so they can have enough oxygen to be able to function and to continue living. If you get below that thermocline, there's a lot less oxygen, and the bass aren't going to spend a lot of time down there just because it's not a really great condition for them. However, they want to be near that thermocline because as you get further down into the water, it gets cooler. There's colder water on the bottom of the lake, and when it's really hot outside in the summer, they want to be in that cooler water, but they don't go below the thermocline because, again, there's not enough oxygen. What this means is those bass are going to be setting up right on that thermocline or just above it for the majority of the summer, and it allows you to determine pretty much exactly where those fish are going to be setting up offshore. And conveniently, you can identify a thermocline using the down imaging or 2D view on your fish finder. All you have to do is idle out into the middle of the lake and find some really deep water, the deepest water on your lake, whether that's 20 feet of water or 100 feet of water. Once you're out in the deepest part of your lake, crank up the sensitivity, and you'll notice a band of water in the middle that will form. This band is the thermocline. If we take a look in this image, you can actually see that there is a lot of dots and fish and particles right above that solid line in the middle of the water column. And those are all the bait fish and the fish. There's not a lot of life below that thermocline, again, because that's where the low oxygen is. And more importantly, you'll notice that in this image, all of the dots, or the bass, are setting up above that line. They're not all the way to the surface, though. They're actually pretty close to that line. And using this image, we can determine those bass are going to be setting up in that 15 to 20 foot of water range, right where that thermocline is. Now, the thermocline doesn't always set up on every single lake, so if you go out to your lake and you crank your sensitivity up and you don't see anything, it might just mean there's no thermocline set up. It only sets up in warmer months during the summer, and sometimes it never sets up at all. It can also vary from one part of your lake to another. So one creek, the thermocline might be in 20 feet of water. In another creek, it might be in 30 feet of water or 35 feet of water. So you're going to have to also check this at different parts of your lake throughout the day. One way to avoid having to mess with the thermocline at all is just look for the depth of the bait fish like I showed earlier. That's pretty much a tried and true method that works all the time. And you also want bait fish in your area anyways if you're going to catch fish. So just look for bait fish, look for the depth. That works. You can also use the thermocline method. That works as well. So in summary, the most important points to determine how deep to fish offshore is first, identifying how deep your bait fish are in your lake, whether that's using your fish finder, by just fishing around on areas, using my water clarity guideline, whatever you want to do, but you need to determine how deep the bait fish are. Wherever the bait fish are, the bass are going to be because they need to eat. A lot of times, guys try to make bass fishing more difficult than it is. If there's bait fish in the area, a lot of times there's going to be bass there. It doesn't mean you're guaranteed to catch bass if there's bait fish in the area. Sometimes the bait fish are there and the bass just haven't found them yet. But more often than not, if you find the bait fish and find how deep the bait fish are, whether that's shad, bluegill, or crawfish, you're going to find bass in that general area. So definitely look for the depth of those bait fish using your fish finder or using the guidelines laid out in this video, and you'll know exactly how deep to fish on your lake offshore. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, leave a like down below and also subscribe to Fish the Moment for more offshore bass fishing content and content about electronics every single week. Thanks again for checking out this video. We'll see you on the next one.